Have you ever noticed that when you're reading the Bible, there seems to be a lot of things going on that at times it's like there's something going on here and I don't know what's going on. It's not telling me. A lot of that is understanding the timeline of the Bible and what's taking place around it. Then you're noticing that it has a bearing on my ability to interpret what's taking place there. So how do we know the timeline? How do we know what's happening around it? That's what we're going to look at in this video. This is a part of a larger video series called The Disciple. If you go to our YouTube channel, Bethel Pittsburgh, go to playlists, you'll find a playlist titled The Disciple. In that playlist, the videos are placed in category order. So this one in particular, so you'll see the title of the videos will say The Disciple, and then the category. This one is under the category of Bible knowledge. And so in this step, we're wanting to know what exactly transpired around the way these books are put together. Because part of the challenge is you'll notice that there might be a number of books initially that are in chronological order, but you hit a certain point where there's overlap between two books. Kings and Chronicles is a good example of that. Or this book fits over here, but then this one fits over here. Or then you get Psalms that fits all over the place. And how do I make sense of what's taking place? And the best way to do a good way to do that actually is to know the timeline of the Bible, how the order of events occur. And so I'm going to go over that whole picture and hopefully a brief version of it. And then at some point in the future in this category, we'll do closer snapshots of this timeline. But for now, we're just giving the overarching view of the timeline. So first, there was the beginning. We get that in Genesis, that God created everything, and then God created humanity, and things started. The Bible doesn't give a clear timeline, although I know that there's different chronologies that give some datings and stuff, and some people believe confidently that they've been able to pinpoint a precise time frame for things, but there's all kinds of complications as to whether or not, biblically that is, they're landing in the right spot. So the earliest estimates would be somewhere in the range of 4 to 10,000 BC. Somewhere in that range is the earliest estimates. Again, most of that's just basing off of chronologies and assuming that there's no gaps and there's no details that kind of create spacing in that. Some people estimate that the earth is millions of years old, if not billions of years old. A lot of times when you get to those older datings, they're basing it more on science than they are on Bible. But again, the Bible isn't abundantly clear, and so there's a tension between that old earth, new earth thing. But that's where we start. We start with the beginning. That's obviously in Genesis, and lots of people start to show up. This is all before Noah and the flood. Lots of people start to show up and live and do things, and some are following the Lord, and a lot of people don't follow the Lord, and that's what resulted in reaching a climax after many generations. And that's the thing to know when you're reading the Scripture, is a lot of times we go from one chapter to another, and we're jumping forward years, sometimes decades, maybe even centuries forward as we're reading the Scripture. And it's not just going moment to moment. So lots of people, and then we reach this climax that most, if not all, but Noah and his family are corrupted. God decides to wipe them out, except for Noah and his family, and they get saved. You know the story likely through the ark. And then that subsides, and then Noah and his family begin to repopulate the earth, and again you get to where there's lots of people. And you land on the story of Abraham, who is a descendant of Noah. Again, you got really generations from Noah going down to Abraham. Abraham surfaces, again, this is still only in Genesis, and we're landing at around 2000 BC when Abraham shows up in the storyline. He's actually moving from, the word shows up there, but I think that's a city. They're really in the land, the area of Mesopotamia historically, and that's where Abraham comes out of that. He ends up wandering through what would become the nation, the land of Israel, and then down to Egypt and back into that land. And Isaac and Jacob kind of follow suit with that. somewhere during this patriarch season, around 2000 BC, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we get Job's story. Now, people have different, and that's the thing with some of these books in the Old Testament, people have different estimates of when they think that took place, but some people believe, and that's my belief too, that Job likely happened at an earlier time during the time of the patriarchs. So that probably slips right in there. Then, several hundred years later, we land on Moses. Moses is around 1400 BC, so about 500 to 600 years after the patriarchs, you get Moses surfacing. That shows up in Exodus. We get Exodus, then Leviticus, then Numbers, then Deuteronomy, all happening during the time of Moses and him leading the Israelites out of Egypt, and they're moving towards the Promised Land. Some of the Psalms end up being written and recorded at this time. Again, like I said, Psalms are all over the place. They're a compilation of prayers and praises and wise statements, and they get collected into one book, which gives the impression that it all happened at one time, but again, they were really scattered. So some of the Psalms are happening during the lifetime of Moses. Then Moses dies, and Joshua surfaces. He leads the Israelites into and conquering the Promised Land, the land of Israel, just right after Moses' death, so still we're somewhere in the range of 1400 BC. Then Joshua dies, and we have a period of judges judging the land of Israel, and that's happening between the ranges of 13 to 1100 BC. Yeah, there's expansion and then loss of land, expansion and loss of land happening during these couple of centuries, but all the judges surface there, and ultimately we end up with Ruth and that whole story, and the line of David being tracked there. So that's happening during that 200-year period. Then we eventually get to 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is somewhere around 1000 BC, in that range. So in 1st Samuel, you get mostly Saul, but he's the acting king. David is supposed to be king. At the end of 1 Samuel, Saul dies, and then in 2 Samuel is when David begins to reign as king, initially over Judah only, and then ultimately he ended up uniting the entire kingdom back under his reign, and 2 Samuel is that. And this is again around 1000 BC, and many people know that David wrote a good amount of the Psalms, so once again, Psalms start surfacing at this time, around 1000 BC, during David's lifetime, and then David dies, and his son Solomon becomes king around 1000 to 900 BC, somewhere in that range. Solomon begins to reign. That's recorded mostly in Kings and Chronicles. And Kings and Chronicles, like I had said before, are running parallel to each other. But they're running not at the same rate of speed. So sometimes Kings is ahead of Chronicles as far as chapter number is concerned, and then sometimes Chronicles moves back ahead of Kings, and so they're not always flowing at the same rate of speed. Now, during Solomon's time, he builds the temple. The book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon end up being written at this time. And if you notice the placement of those books are past this point. There are a few books in between Kings and Chronicles and those wisdom books. We just have to remember that they're actually sitting back in that other time period as far as the context of where they sit. Now, David then died, and his son Rehoboam became king. Again, around 900 BC or so, Rehoboam becomes king. And the tribes of Israel were protesting the way certain things were. They were led by Jeroboam in that protest, and Rehoboam resisted it. So the tribes of Israel, all except Judah, rebelled against Judah and the king of Rehoboam, and ended up establishing a separate nation. So you now have Israel as one nation and Judah as a second nation, and both have kings. Now, as you follow the storyline in Kings and Chronicles, Israel, every one of the kings are wicked, and Judah, many are wicked, some are not wicked, some serve the Lord, and it's why the captivity for these two nations happens separately. Israel gets taken captive first, and Judah gets taken captive second. And we're in a period of what's called pre-exilic. So it's before these nations come and take these guys captive and most of them off the land. So you have a pre-exilic time period. In the total pre-exilic time period where both nations were not in exile, runs from about 900 to 721 BC. And during Kings of Chronicles, you'll see there's King of Israel, King of Judah. Again, they're separate nations. Now, God began to confront the idolatry in both nations, and he would send prophets. We see Elijah show up, and then Elisha, his apprentice, who takes over for him. There were no written biblical books that came from them, but we do see their ministry and them prophesying during that time period. It was during this total pre-exilic period that prophets like Amos, Jonah, Hosea, possibly Joel show up. And again, there are some debates on exactly where these different prophetic books land, but many think they landed in this spot. And these prophets are warning both nations that if you don't submit to God, then this captivity will take place. And this will help us know context when we're reading prophecies. This is what they're pointing to. And ultimately, that does take place. So around 721 BC, Israel, not Judah, Israel gets taken captive by Assyria. Some people, some of the poor would remain in the land, but most of the population was removed off the property of Israel. We do see this happen in the book of Kings, but the people in Judah still continue in idolatry, and so you have a partial pre-exilic period. Israel's not in exile, or no, Judah's not in exile, but Israel is. And during this time, which is around 921 to 597 BC, you get other prophets surface. Now, some of them overlap, like Isaiah and Micah may have prophesied before Israel was taken captive and after Israel was taken captive. But you get, again, especially in Isaiah, pointing to look what's coming if you don't stop. Then during this partial exilic period where Judah is not in exile but Israel is, you potentially get prophets like Zephaniah, Nahum, Obadiah, Habakkuk. And again, I encourage you to note where these are sitting in chronology and where they're sitting in book order. And you'll notice the book order is not setting them in chronological order. So it's good to be aware of this. Then around 597 BC, Judah gets taken captive. Now this ends up being a shorter captivity period. They remain in captivity till about 538, and then Persia conquers Babylon, and Persia releases the Jews back into the land of Judah and the land of Israel. It's during this exilic period. Now there's some overlap, like Jeremiah and potentially Ezekiel, but definitely Jeremiah with his book Lamentations as well, is prophesying before the Babylonian captivity of Judah happens, and during and after. Ezekiel's prophesying after, Daniel is prophesying after. And then they get returned. This is where you get the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are happening in this range of this Babylonian captivity and the return. And then it's also during this time that prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and then lastly Malachi show up, somewhere around 450 BC. And this is the period it's called the intertestamental period. From 450 BC to around 6 BC, there is no biblical writing that's taking place. That's a long time, over 400 years between the Old to the New Testament, in which no biblical writing is taking place. That doesn't mean things weren't happening. So around 490 BC is when Greece conquered Persia. And then around 146 BC is when Rome conquered Greece. And when we land in the New Testament, Rome is the ruling power. So that's the intertestamental period. Some people will refer to it as like a dark ages type period because we don't have any biblical revelation about that time period. So then, of course, we land in the New Testament. This is much shorter because the Old Testament covers thousands of years. New Testament just covers in the range of 1 century, less than 1 century. So around 6 BC to 6 AD is when Jesus' early childhood, and John the Baptist's early childhood is mentioned in here too, but predominantly Jesus' early childhood that that newborn to 12, those infancy and child stories are happening around 6 BC to 6 AD. And then Jesus began to do his ministry somewhere in the range of 25 to 30 AD. So the things that happened in the Gospels are happening during that time. And then around 30 to 60 AD is when the events of Acts. Again, turning pages, when we're going from chapter to chapter, sometimes we don't realize from one chapter to another, we're jumping forward years. Because the book of Acts is covering events that happened over the course of 30 years. It's likely doing it in a chronologically orderly fashion, but again, from Acts 1 to Acts 28, we're moving forward the course of 30 years. All the epistles begin to surface during these activities, and the writing of the Gospels begin to surface during these activities that are happening in Acts and beyond. So the first New Testament book that likely surfaced was James around 44 to 49 AD, Galatians around 49 to 50 AD. Then the Gospel of Mark gets recorded, the earliest Gospel likely to be recorded around 50 to 60 AD. Then 1 Thessalonians around 51, 2 Thessalonians around 52, 1 Corinthians around 55, 2 Corinthians around 56. Again, notice that the book order is not the chronological order. Then Romans around 56 AD, the Gospel of Luke recorded possibly around 60 to 61 AD. Then between 60 and 62 AD, you get Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon getting written. Around 62 AD, the book of Acts gets written down and recorded. And then 1 Timothy around 62 to 64, Titus around 62 to 64, 1 Peter around 64, 65, 2 Timothy around 66, 67, 2 Peter around 67, 68, Hebrews 67 to 69, Jude 68 to 70. And then the latter books that get recorded are John's epistles. If I didn't mention that, Jude is 68 to 70. John writes his gospel around between 80 to 90 AD. Then his epistles, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, around 90 to 95 AD, and Revelation somewhere around 96 AD. So this is the way these events are unfolding. What happens is Peter and Paul get executed. That kind of is what brings Acts to a halt, and a lot of the biblical writings stop at that point, with, again, the exception of John's writings. And then that concludes the timeline of Scripture. So I know that's a lot. I tried to take a real fast as I could overview of the entire picture. Like I said, in the future we'll do videos that really hone in on specific parts of that timeline. If you have any questions on that, just leave it in the comments. Or if you would like to grow in your faith more in person and you live in the Pittsburgh area, we'd love for you to join us at Bethel Assembly of God, 2501 Staten Street, Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. and Sundays at 10 a.m. God bless.